The afternoon light filtered weakly through the stained glass windows of Lockhart Manor's chapel as whispers followed Lillian Bramwell like a shadow. She stood perfectly still in her mother's altered wedding gown, her fingers gripping a small bouquet of winter roses so tightly that the stems threatened to snap. At 18, she had become the subject of London society's most pitying whispers. "Poor Miss Bramwell," Mrs. Winthrop murmured behind her glove, "sacrificed to a dying man to pay her father's debts." "The Duke of Lockhart," another voice added with false sympathy. "They say consumption has him in its grip. A marriage bed that shall become a deathbed before spring arrives." Lillian's cheeks burned with shame, but her posture remained perfect as her uncle had demanded since the marriage was arranged. Her Uncle Charles approached now, taking his place in the front pew with an expression of cold satisfaction. "You shall hold your head high," he had told her that morning, "for you have secured a duchy when your father left us nothing but ruin. His debts would have seen us all in the workhouse." Hello, my lovely listeners. A lady friend of mine swore we'd never reach 1,000 subscribers because the world has grown too cynical for some good old-fashioned romance. Shall we prove her wrong? Tap that subscribe button if you believe in love and help us reach that milestone together. And give this video a like, so it gets pushed to love enthusiasts like us. Now back to our story. The vicar cleared his throat, and the small congregation fell silent. The handful of guests turned their attention to the chapel entrance, and a collective gasp rippled through the room. The Duke of Lockhart had arrived. Though tall and once powerfully built, Benjamin Lockhart leaned heavily upon an ebony walking stick. His face, still handsome despite the ravages of illness, looked carved from pale marble, marked with deep shadows of suffering. At 38, he moved with the slow, careful steps of a man 3 times his age. He approached Lillian with measured movements, each step punctuated by the tap of his cane against the stone floor. The guests watched with held breath as he took his place beside his bride. "Miss Bramwell," he said quietly, his voice deeper and warmer than she had expected from a man so visibly frail. "You look very lovely." Lillian curtsied slightly, lowering her gaze as propriety demanded. "Your Grace," she whispered. "You are kind to say so." "I speak only truth," he replied, and when she dared to glance up, she found his grey eyes watching her with an expression she could not quite name. Not pity, not desire, but something softer and more complex. The ceremony began. The vicar spoke the ancient words about love and devotion, and they sounded almost cruel in this chapel where everyone knew the groom was dying. When it came time for Benjamin to speak his vows, he turned to face Lillian fully. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for hers, but his grip, though weakened by fever, held surprising gentleness. "I, Benjamin Edward Lockhart, take thee, Lillian Catherine Bramwell, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." His voice never wavered, and Lillian felt something shift in her chest at the earnestness in his tone. When her turn came, Lillian spoke clearly and steadily. "I, Lillian Catherine Bramwell, take thee, Benjamin Edward Lockhart, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." As she spoke the words, she made a silent promise to herself that however brief this marriage might be, she would honor these vows with her whole heart. The emerald and diamond ring slipped onto her finger, loose but beautiful, and the vicar pronounced them man and wife. The wedding breakfast that followed was a quiet, uncomfortable affair. Uncle Charles made a speech about duty and family honor that made Lillian want to flee the room. Dr. Cavendish, the Duke's physician, stood near the doorway with his medical bag, watching Benjamin with the keen eyes of a man constantly measuring time. When the last guest finally departed, Lillian expected to be shown to her own chambers, separate rooms as would be proper given Benjamin's condition. But as she rose from the table, Benjamin stood as well, using his cane for support. "Duchess," he said, and she startled at the title before realizing he meant her. "Would you grant me a few moments of your time? In the library, perhaps? There is something I must tell you, and I find I cannot wait any longer to say it." His grey eyes held such intensity that Lillian found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "Of course, Your Grace." "Benjamin," he corrected gently. "We are married now, after all. And I have never cared much for formality in my own home." They walked slowly through the manor's corridors, Benjamin leaning more heavily on her arm with each step. She could feel the fever burning through his coat, could hear the wheeze in every breath he took. The library, when they reached it, was warm and welcoming, filled with leather-bound books and lit by a crackling fire. Benjamin waited until she was seated in a comfortable chair before lowering himself carefully into the one across from her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I must tell you why I truly chose you, Lillian. And I promise you, it was not for duty. Not mine, at least. It was for love, but perhaps not the love you might expect." The fire crackled softly in the library's hearth, casting dancing shadows across Benjamin's gaunt features as he reached into his waistcoat pocket. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though each gesture cost him precious energy he could ill afford to spend. Lillian sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the firelight. She had expected many things from this marriage, but a private conversation on her wedding night had not been among them. Benjamin withdrew a small object wrapped in faded silk. His fingers trembled as he carefully unfolded the cloth, revealing an oval miniature portrait no larger than a bird's egg. He gazed at it for a long moment, his expression softening with a tenderness that transformed his illness-ravaged face. Then, without a word, he leaned forward and placed it gently in Lillian's palm. The woman in the portrait was young and radiant, captured in the bloom of her early 20s. She had dark chestnut hair arranged in the fashion of 20 years past, and her eyes, painted with exquisite skill, seemed to sparkle with life and mischief. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face as well as she knew her own reflection. "My mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "This is my mother, Catherine." Benjamin nodded slowly, his grey eyes never leaving Lillian's face. "I commissioned that portrait in the spring of 1833. She was 23, and I was but 21. We had known each other since childhood, our families' estates neighbouring one another in Devonshire. But that spring, everything changed between us." He paused, reaching for the glass of water that sat on the table beside him. His hand shook as he brought it to his lips, and Lillian resisted the urge to help him. When he continued, his voice was stronger, as though the memories themselves gave him renewed strength. "Catherine had the most remarkable spirit. She loved to read philosophy and argue about politics, much to her mother's horror. She could ride better than most men I knew, and she had a laugh that could fill an entire room with joy. I fell in love with her that spring, desperately and completely, and by some miracle, she loved me in return." Lillian clutched the miniature portrait tighter, her heart racing. Her mother had never spoken of any man before her father. The Catherine she had known was quiet, subdued, worn down by years of marriage to a man who drank away their fortune and treated her with cold indifference. Benjamin reached into his pocket again, this time withdrawing a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. "We wrote to each other every day that summer. Her father approved of the match. We planned to marry in the autumn, after the harvest." He set the letters on the table between them, his expression growing darker. "But in August, I received my commission. The East India Company needed officers for the colonial service, and my father insisted I go. He said a man must prove himself before he takes a wife, that I was too young to marry, that adventure and duty called. I was foolish enough to believe him." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Lillian thought he might be too overcome to continue. But then he drew a shaky breath and pressed on. "I promised Catherine I would return within 2 years. She begged me not to go, but I was young and arrogant, full of dreams of glory and honor. I sailed in September of 1833, convinced that our love could withstand any separation. Benjamin's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. I did not return for 7 years. Lillian's hands had gone cold despite the warmth of the fire. She could picture it all too clearly now, her young mother waiting and waiting while the man she loved stayed away in some distant colony. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Why did you stay away so long?" Benjamin's jaw tightened. War happened. Rebellion. Disease. I was promoted, given command of a garrison in a remote territory where letters took months to arrive if they arrived at all. I wrote to Catherine constantly, but I learned later that most of my letters never reached her. The few that did were months old by the time she received them. And her letters to me, they arrived sporadically, sometimes 3 or 4 at once, sometimes none for half a year. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Lillian. In her last letter to me, the one I received in the spring of 1840, she told me she had married your father. The pain in those words was so raw that Lillian felt it like a physical blow. She could not wait any longer, Benjamin continued, his voice rough with emotion. 7 years she had waited for me, and her family was pressing her to marry. Your father, the Earl of Bramwell, was wealthy and respectable. Her mother told her I was never coming back, that I had likely found some colonial bride and forgotten all about her. So she married him in the winter of 1839. He reached for another letter from the bundle, one that looked more worn than all the others, as though it had been read 1,000 times. But she wrote to me one final time after her marriage. She told me she had married out of duty, not love. She told me she would always carry me in her heart. And she made me promise that if anything should ever happen to her, I would watch over her children. Lillian felt tears burning behind her eyes. Her mother had been just 19 when she married the Earl, the same age Lillian would be in a few months. She had always seemed so sad, so distant, as though part of her lived somewhere far away. Now Lillian understood why. "When did you finally return to England?" she asked. "In 1841, 10 months after I received her letter. I came home immediately, but by then she was already expecting her first child, your eldest brother Arthur. I went to her father's estate once, saw her from a distance at a garden party. She was heavy with child, and your father stood beside her, his hand possessive on her arm. She saw me across the lawn, and the look in her eyes nearly destroyed me." Benjamin's hands clenched into fists. "I left Devonshire that same day and swore never to return. I purchased this estate in Northumberland, as far from her as I could manage while remaining in England. I threw myself into managing my lands, into Parliament, into anything that might help me forget. But I never stopped thinking about her." The silence that followed was heavy with grief and lost years. Lillian looked down at the miniature portrait in her hand, at her mother's young, hopeful face, and felt her heart break for both of them. "When did she die?" Benjamin asked gently, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. 2 years ago, Lillian replied, her voice thick with tears. "My father's drinking had worsened, and the debts were mounting. She grew ill that winter, and the doctor said it was her heart. She simply grew weaker and weaker until one morning, she did not wake." Benjamin closed his eyes and bowed his head. For a long moment, he said nothing, but Lillian could see his shoulders shaking with silent grief. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet with tears. "I learned of her death through the newspapers. They mentioned she left behind 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter named Lillian Catherine. I began making inquiries after that, quietly, through intermediaries. I learned that your father had drunk away most of the fortune, that your brothers had scattered to seek their fortunes abroad, that you remained with your uncle who was eager to marry you off to settle the family debts." He leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. "I could not save your mother, Lillian. I failed her completely, but I could keep my promise to her. I could watch over her daughter. I could save you from a marriage to some cruel old man who saw you only as a bargaining piece. So I made your uncle an offer he could not refuse." Understanding crashed over Lillian like a wave. You married me to keep your promise to my mother. I married you to honor the woman I loved my entire life, Benjamin corrected gently. You have her eyes. Did you know that? The same shape, the same way they shift color in different light. And when you spoke your vows today, your voice had the same quality hers did, clear and strong despite your fear. He reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but warm. I know I am dying, Lillian. Dr. Cavendish gives me perhaps 4 to 6 months. But in that time, I can ensure you are protected. You will inherit this estate, this fortune, everything I possess. You will never be at the mercy of men like your uncle again. You will be free to live your life as you choose. It is the only gift I can give to Catherine's daughter, and I give it gladly. Lillian stared at him, this dying man who had married her not out of desperation or convenience, but out of love for a woman who had died 2 years ago. She thought of all the pitying whispers, the cold calculation in her uncle's eyes, the way society had labeled her a sacrificial lamb. But Benjamin had not seen her that way at all. He had seen Catherine's daughter, a young woman in need of protection, and he had offered everything he had to keep a promise made 20 years ago. You are the most honorable man I have ever known, she said finally, tears streaming down her cheeks. My mother was blessed to have been loved by you. Benjamin smiled then, a real smile that briefly pushed back the shadows of pain on his face. And I was blessed to have loved her, even if I lost her. Love like that, Lillian, it does not die just because time passes or circumstances change. It endures. It shapes everything that comes after. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. You need not love me, child. I ask only that you allow me to fulfill this one final duty to the woman who owned my heart. Let me give you the future your mother would have wanted for you. Lillian looked at the miniature portrait still clutched in her hand, at her mother's young, radiant face, and then at Benjamin, this man who had carried that love for more than 20 years. Something shifted inside her chest, a strange mixture of grief and gratitude and the beginning of something she could not yet name. I will honor your gift, she whispered. But I will not simply wait for you to die, Your Grace. If you loved my mother as much as you say, then you will allow me to care for you properly in whatever time remains. Benjamin's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but then he nodded, that small smile returning. As you wish, Duchess. As you wish. The days following that first evening in the library settled into a pattern that surprised Lillian with its quiet intimacy. Each afternoon, when Benjamin's strength was at its peak, she would join him in the library or the small conservatory at the back of the manor. There, surrounded by books or the winterbear plants that waited for spring, he would tell her stories of her mother's youth, painting a picture of a woman Lillian had never truly known. Catherine had been fearless as a girl, he told her, climbing trees in her finest dresses and challenging the local boys to races on horseback. She had kept a collection of rocks and fossils that she studied with scientific precision, much to her mother's despair. She had taught herself Latin from her brother's textbooks and could quote poetry in 3 languages. The Catherine of Benjamin's memories was vibrant and alive, so different from the quiet, worn woman who had raised Lillian in the shadow of her father's drinking and disappointment. She once convinced me to help her smuggle a fox kit into her bedroom, Benjamin said one afternoon, a rare smile crossing his face. She found it injured in the woods and insisted on nursing it back to health. We kept it hidden for nearly 2 weeks before her maid discovered it and raised such an alarm that the entire household came running. He laughed softly, then immediately pressed his handkerchief to his mouth as the laughter dissolved into coughing. Lillian watched with growing concern as the fit passed, noting the way his hand trembled and the sheen of sweat that appeared on his brow despite the cool temperature of the room. Benjamin also spoke of the war, though these stories came harder and with longer pauses between words. He described the heat and dust of the colonies, the violence that had seemed so glorious from a distance but had revealed itself as merely brutal and senseless up close. He spoke of men he had commanded who never came home, of letters he had written to widows and mothers, of the slow realization that glory was a word used by old men to send young men to their deaths. I told myself I was serving England, serving honor, he said one grey morning as they sat in the conservatory. But the truth is, I was serving my own pride. I wanted to prove myself worthy of Catherine, to return to her covered in medals and accomplishments. Instead, I stayed away so long that I lost her entirely." The bitterness in his voice was matched by the exhaustion in his eyes. "Pride is an expensive thing, Lillian. It cost me everything that mattered." Lillian found herself drawn deeper into these conversations, asking questions, offering observations, sharing her own memories of her mother in return. She told him how Catherine had taught her to read using books of poetry, how she had insisted Lillian learn more than just needlework and dancing. "She used to tell me that a woman's mind was her own fortress," Lillian said, "that no one could take away what we carried in our thoughts and hearts." Benjamin's eyes had filled with tears at that. "That sounds exactly like something she would say. She gave you the best of herself, even when circumstances tried to diminish her." The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, built not on romance but on shared grief and understanding. Lillian began to see Benjamin not as the dying duke she had been forced to marry, but as a man of deep feeling and profound regret, someone who had loved so completely that it had shaped the entire course of his life. But even as their connection deepened, Benjamin's physical condition grew steadily worse. The coughing spells became more frequent and more violent. Some mornings, he could not leave his bed at all, and Lillian would sit beside him, reading aloud from books of poetry or history while he drifted in and out of feverish sleep. His appetite, never strong, diminished to almost nothing. The servants whispered about how his clothes hung loose on his frame, how he needed assistance now even for the short walk from his bedroom to the library. The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. Lillian had been reading to Benjamin in the library when he suddenly stiffened in his chair. His face went pale, then flushed with terrible color. He tried to speak, but instead, a violent coughing fit seized him, so powerful that it bent him double. Lillian dropped her book and rushed to his side, her hands hovering uselessly as the coughs tore through him like waves. When he finally pulled the handkerchief away from his mouth, it was stained bright red with blood. Not just flecks, as Lillian had seen before, but fresh, vivid blood that seemed to drain the remaining color from Benjamin's face. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not just pain but fear. "Dr. Cavendish," he managed to whisper. "Send for Dr. Cavendish." The doctor arrived within the hour, his face grave as he examined Benjamin in the privacy of his bedchamber. Lillian waited in the hallway outside, pacing back and forth across the carpet, her heart hammering in her chest. She had known Benjamin was dying from the moment she agreed to marry him, but knowing and witnessing were entirely different things. The violence of that coughing spell, the blood, the terror in his eyes had made death suddenly, horribly real. When Dr. Cavendish finally emerged, he gestured for Lillian to follow him to a small sitting room down the hall. He was a man in his 50s, stern and precise, with silver hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing. He waited until they were both seated before speaking, his tone professional but not unkind. "Your Grace, I believe it is time we spoke plainly about the Duke's condition. The consumption has progressed significantly in recent weeks. The hemorrhaging we saw today indicates that the disease has advanced to the lungs' deeper tissues." He paused, watching her carefully. "I must ask you to prepare yourself for the reality that His Grace has very little time remaining. 4 months at most, perhaps 6 if we are fortunate. But the decline will be rapid and unpleasant. He will grow weaker, the coughing will worsen, and toward the end, there will be significant pain." Lillian felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. 4 to 6 months. Spring would barely have arrived before Benjamin was gone. She thought of all the stories he still had to tell her, all the afternoons they might have shared, all the ways she had only just begun to know him. "Is there nothing that can be done?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "No treatment, no medicine that might help?" Dr. Cavendish shook his head slowly. "Consumption is a wasting disease, Your Grace. We can make him comfortable with laudanum for the pain, and we can ensure he has fresh air and rest, but there is no cure. The best physicians in London have examined the Duke over the past year, and all have reached the same conclusion. I am deeply sorry, but you must accept what cannot be changed." Accept what cannot be changed. The words echoed in Lillian's mind as she sat there, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her entire life, she had been taught to accept things, to be dutiful, to bow to circumstances beyond her control. She had accepted her father's drinking, her family's ruin, the marriage to a dying man. She had been raised to be passive, to endure, to wait patiently for whatever fate dealt her. But something in her rebelled against those words now. She thought of Catherine, the fearless girl who had climbed trees and studied fossils and taught herself Latin. She thought of Benjamin, lying in his bed upstairs, still fighting to live despite the disease consuming him from within. She thought of the love story that had been stolen by time and distance and pride, and of the second chance that was slipping away even as she sat here. "Thank you for your honesty, Dr. Cavendish," she said finally, rising to her feet. "I appreciate your candor about the Duke's condition." The doctor stood as well, clearly satisfied that she had accepted the situation with proper feminine resignation. "You are very brave, Your Grace. Many young ladies in your position would fall into hysterics. The Duke is fortunate to have married someone so sensible." Lillian nodded politely, but inside, her mind was already racing. Sensible. Accepting. Resigned. She had been all those things her entire life. And what had it earned her? A dying husband, a fortune built on grief, and a future as a wealthy widow who had never truly lived at all. As Dr. Cavendish gathered his medical bag and prepared to leave, Lillian made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and force. She would not simply accept Benjamin's death. She would not sit by his bedside and watch him waste away while London's finest physicians shrugged and offered nothing but laudanum and false comfort. If the best doctors in England had no answers, then perhaps the answers lay elsewhere. Perhaps there was someone, somewhere, who might see what Dr. Cavendish could not, who might offer hope where English medicine offered only resignation. That evening, after Benjamin had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep aided by the laudanum Dr. Cavendish had left, Lillian went to the manor's study. There, by candlelight, she began writing letters. She wrote to physicians in Edinburgh, known for their advanced medical training. She wrote to doctors in Paris and Vienna, cities where medical science was said to be more progressive than in conservative London. She wrote to anyone whose name she could find in Benjamin's extensive library, anyone who might have knowledge or experience with consumption. Her hand cramped from writing, and the candles burned low, but Lillian kept going. Benjamin had married her to fulfill a promise to her mother, to give her freedom and protection and a future. The least she could do in return was fight for his life with every resource and ounce of determination she possessed. If love could endure across 20 years and beyond death itself, as Benjamin had shown her, then surely it could be strong enough to challenge the medical certainty of 4 learned London doctors. She signed the last letter as dawn began to break outside the study windows. Her eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but her heart felt lighter than it had since that terrible coughing spell in the library. She did not know if any of these letters would bring help, or if they would all return with polite rejections and confirmations of Dr. Cavendish's diagnosis. But she knew with absolute certainty that she had to try. Benjamin had given everything to honor his love for her mother. The very least Lillian could do was fight with equal devotion to keep him alive. The responses to Lillian's letters began arriving within a fortnight, and with each one, her hope dimmed a little more. The Edinburgh physicians wrote back with sympathy but little else, confirming Dr. Cavendish's diagnosis and offering the same remedies of fresh air, rest, and laudanum for pain. A doctor from Paris sent a lengthy treatise on the nature of consumption, complete with detailed descriptions of the disease's progression, but no suggestion of treatment beyond what was already being done. A Viennese specialist wrote that he had seen hundreds of such cases and knew of no cure, though he recommended a spa in the Austrian mountains that might provide some comfort in the Duke's final months. Lillian read each letter in the privacy of her room, her frustration mounting with every polite rejection and sympathetic platitude. The medical establishment, it seemed, had collectively decided that consumption was an inevitable death sentence, and no amount of pleading or desperation would change their minds. But she refused to accept their certainty. Somewhere in the vast world of medicine, there had to be someone who thought differently, who questioned the accepted wisdom, who might see what others had missed. The financial reality of her search became apparent quickly. Consulting with foreign physicians required payment, often substantial sums sent in advance to secure their attention. The responses that did offer to examine Benjamin in person quoted fees that made Lillian's breath catch. She had access to the household accounts for daily expenses, but large withdrawals would require explanation to Benjamin's solicitor, and she was not ready to reveal what she was doing. Not yet. Not until she had something concrete to offer beyond desperate hope. So Lillian turned to the only assets that were truly hers. In the quiet of her bedchamber, she spread out the modest collection of jewelry she had brought from her former home. There was her grandmother's pearl necklace, her mother's garnet brooch, a pair of sapphire earrings that had been a gift for her 16th birthday, and several smaller pieces. None of them were grand enough to be entailed to the estate or valuable enough to have been seized for her father's debts. They were hers, and she could do with them as she wished. The following Tuesday, while Benjamin rested upstairs, Lillian took a carriage into the nearby market town. She wore a simple dress and a heavy veil, hoping to pass unnoticed. The jeweller's shop was tucked down a side street, its windows displaying modest trinkets and silver plate. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, examined her pieces with practiced efficiency. "Good quality," he murmured, turning the pearl necklace in the light. "The garnets are particularly fine. I can offer you £80 for the lot." Lillian had no idea if this was fair, but she had no time to negotiate or seek other offers. "I accept," she said quietly, and tried not to think about her mother's hands fastening that garnet brooch, or her grandmother's smile when she had clasped the pearls around Lillian's neck on her wedding day to her father. Some things mattered more than sentiment. Benjamin's life mattered more than jewelry. With the money secured, Lillian expanded her search. She wrote to medical societies, to universities known for scientific research, to anyone who might point her toward physicians willing to challenge conventional thinking. She became adept at crafting letters that conveyed both urgency and credibility, that made clear she had the means to pay for serious consultation. She haunted Benjamin's library, reading every medical text she could find, trying to understand the disease that was killing him so that she might better explain his symptoms to potential healers. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that she first encountered the name Dr. Klaus Richter. She had been reading a medical journal from Berlin, one of several foreign publications Benjamin subscribed to, when she came across an article describing revolutionary surgical techniques being developed in Prussia. The author mentioned Dr. Richter's controversial work on internal infections and his radical insistence on cleanliness in surgical procedures. Most interestingly, the article noted that Dr. Richter had successfully treated several cases that had been misdiagnosed by other physicians, conditions that presented symptoms similar to other diseases but had entirely different underlying causes. Lillian read the article 3 times, her heart beginning to race. What if Benjamin's consumption was not consumption at all? What if there was something else causing his symptoms, something that might be treatable? It seemed too much to hope for, but the possibility alone was enough to make her hands shake as she copied down the address of Dr. Richter's clinic in Berlin. She wrote to him that same night, her letter longer and more detailed than any she had sent before. She described Benjamin's symptoms in careful detail, the progression of his illness, the treatments that had been tried and failed. She mentioned the blood he coughed up, the fever that never quite broke, the wasting of his body despite efforts to maintain his strength. She enclosed a bank draft large enough to secure his attention and closed with a plea that came straight from her heart. "I am writing to you because every physician in London has pronounced my husband's case hopeless, but I cannot accept that there is nothing to be done. If there is even the smallest possibility that you might see something they have missed, I beg you to consider his case." The letter went out with the Morning Post, and Lillian tried to prepare herself for disappointment. Berlin was far away, and Dr. Richter was clearly a busy man with many demands on his time. He might not respond at all, or his response might echo all the others she had received. But at least she had tried. At least she could tell herself she had left no possibility unexplored. Benjamin discovered what she was doing on a cold March morning when he came down to breakfast earlier than expected. Lillian had been reviewing correspondence in the small morning room, several letters spread across the desk before her. She had not heard his approach until his cane tapped against the doorframe, and when she looked up, startled, she saw him taking in the scene with those penetrating grey eyes. "You have been writing a great many letters lately," he observed quietly, moving slowly into the room. "The servants tell me you send out post nearly every day, and that you made a trip to town last week that you did not mention." He lowered himself carefully into a chair across from her, his breathing labored from the effort of descending the stairs. "What are you doing, Lillian?" There was no point in lying, and Lillian had never been skilled at deception. She met his gaze directly, lifting her chin with a determination that surprised them both. "I am searching for a doctor who might be able to help you. Someone who will not simply accept that you must die because that is what consumption always does. Someone who might see something that Dr. Cavendish and all the others have missed." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached across the desk and gently took her hand. "Lillian, I know you mean well, but you must understand that I have already consulted with the finest physicians in England. Dr. Cavendish is not some country doctor operating out of ignorance. He trained at the best medical schools, and he has seen hundreds of consumption cases. If there were anything to be done, he would know it." But Lillian shook her head, her grip on his hand tightening. "The finest physicians in England all think the same way, trained in the same schools, reading the same books. What if there is knowledge elsewhere that they do not have? What if someone in Prussia or Vienna or Paris has discovered something new?" She pulled one of the medical journals closer, pointing to the article about Dr. Richter. "This doctor in Berlin has challenged accepted medical thinking before and been proven right. He has treated patients other doctors said were hopeless. I have written to him, and I am waiting for his response." Benjamin's face softened with something that looked like both affection and sorrow. "My dear girl, do you know how much these foreign consultations cost? Even if this Dr. Richter responds, and even if he agrees to examine me, the expense would be enormous. You cannot throw away your future security on what is almost certainly false hope." "It is not your decision to make," Lillian said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Those were my jewels that I sold, my money that I am spending. And if I choose to spend every penny I have trying to save your life, that is my right as your wife." She saw his eyes widen at her vehemence, but she pressed on. "You married me to fulfill a promise to my mother, to give me security and freedom. But do you know what my mother would have wanted more than anything? She would have wanted you to live. She would have wanted you to have the long, full life that you both deserved but were denied." Benjamin's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his eyes suddenly bright with moisture. "Lillian, I do not want you to waste yourself on a battle that cannot be won. I am at peace with what is coming. I have made my arrangements, ensured your future. Let that be enough." "It is not enough," Lillian said, and she was startled to realize there were tears running down her cheeks. "Not for me. You told me that love endures, that it shapes everything that comes after. Well, perhaps I am beginning to understand what that means. You loved my mother for 20 years, loved her enough to marry her daughter to keep a promise. Can you not see that I have come to care for you in these weeks? That the thought of losing you has become unbearable?" She pulled her hand from his and stood, walking to the window so he would not see how much she was shaking. "I know our marriage is not a conventional one. I know you wed me out of duty to the past. But I will not sit idle and watch you die when there might be something, anything, that could help. I cannot do it, Benjamin. I simply cannot." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Lillian kept her back turned, staring out at the grey March landscape, waiting for him to argue further or to forbid her from continuing her search. But when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle and filled with wonder. "You truly mean to fight for me, do you not? A dying man you barely know, married to you under the strangest of circumstances, and yet you would spend your resources and exhaust yourself trying to save me." Lillian turned back to face him, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "I mean to try, at least. I cannot promise success, and I know the odds are against us. But I have to try, Benjamin. Please do not ask me to simply accept this. Benjamin looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. It was as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as Catherine's daughter or a duty to be fulfilled, but as Lillian herself, a young woman of courage and determination who refused to surrender without a fight. "Very well," he said quietly. "I will not stand in your way. If you believe there is hope to be found, then search for it with my blessing. But Lillian, I want you to promise me something in return." "Anything," she said. "Promise me that you will not blame yourself if this search leads nowhere. Promise me that when the time comes, if it comes, you will let me go with grace and not torture yourself with thoughts of what might have been." His grey eyes held her steadily. "Can you give me that promise?" Lillian hesitated, then slowly nodded. "I promise that I will try." It was not quite what he had asked for, but it was the best she could offer, and from the sad smile on his face, Benjamin understood. Dr. Klaus Richter's response arrived on a grey April morning, nearly 3 weeks after Lillian had sent her letter. The envelope bore foreign stamps and a wax seal pressed with an unfamiliar crest. Lillian's hands trembled as she broke it open, her heart hammering as she unfolded the single sheet of thick paper covered in precise, angular handwriting. The letter was brief and direct, written in English that was grammatically perfect but somehow foreign in its construction. Dr. Richter acknowledged receipt of her letter and the bank draft. He found the case intriguing, particularly her detailed description of symptoms that did not quite align with typical consumption progression. He would be traveling to London in mid-April to deliver a lecture at the Royal College of Physicians and could arrange to examine the Duke during that visit. His consultation fee would be substantial, but he would credit the advance she had already sent. He closed with a sentence that made Lillian's breath catch in her throat. "I make no promises, Your Grace, but I have learned in my years of practice that certainty is often the enemy of truth." Lillian read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to bring it to Benjamin. She found him in the conservatory, wrapped in blankets despite the mild spring air, a book lying forgotten in his lap. He had declined noticeably in the past weeks. The bones of his face stood out in sharp relief, and the dark circles under his eyes had deepened to bruises. Even the simple act of turning his head to look at her seemed to cost him effort. "He has agreed to come," she said without preamble, sitting down beside him and placing the letter in his hands. "Dr. Richter will be in London next week, and he will examine you." Benjamin read the letter slowly, his brow furrowing. When he looked up, his expression was carefully neutral. "You understand that this may lead nowhere? That he will likely reach the same conclusion as Dr. Cavendish and all the others?" "I understand," Lillian replied. "But at least we will know we tried everything possible." Benjamin nodded slowly and handed the letter back to her. "Then we shall receive him, and I shall submit to yet another examination. Though I warn you, Dr. Cavendish will not be pleased when he learns of this." Dr. Cavendish was, in fact, more than displeased when Lillian informed him of the impending visit. His face flushed with indignation as he stood in the drawing room, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. "A Prussian doctor? Your Grace, I must advise you most strongly against this course of action. These foreign physicians, they make grand claims and charge exorbitant fees, but their methods are often unproven and sometimes dangerous. The Duke's condition is delicate. Subjecting him to unnecessary examination and false hope could hasten his decline." Lillian met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Cavendish, but the decision has been made. Dr. Richter comes highly recommended, and his expertise in complex cases is well documented. Surely there can be no harm in seeking a second opinion from a physician with different training and perspective." "No harm." Dr. Cavendish's voice rose slightly. "Your Grace, I have been the Duke's physician for 15 years. I know his constitution, his medical history, every treatment that has been attempted. This Dr. Richter will sweep in, spend an hour examining the Duke, charge you an enormous sum, and tell you exactly what I have already said. It is a waste of resources and, worse, it gives false hope where none should exist. But Lillian remained firm, and in the end, Dr. Cavendish had no choice but to acquiesce. He left the manor in a state of rigid disapproval, and Lillian knew she had likely made an enemy of him. Yet she could not bring herself to regret it. If Dr. Cavendish's certainty was so unshakable, then surely he had nothing to fear from another physician's opinion. Dr. Richter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-April, his carriage pulling up to Lockhart Manor just as a spring rain began to fall. Lillian watched from the drawing-room window as he emerged, and her first thought was that he looked nothing like any English doctor she had ever encountered. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and a short, neatly trimmed beard. He wore a plain black suit without any of the flourishes favored by London physicians, and he carried a large leather case that looked more like a craftsman's toolbox than a medical bag. When he was shown into the drawing-room, he bowed formally to Lillian but did not waste time on pleasantries. "Your Grace, I thank you for the opportunity to examine your husband. I have read your letter many times during my journey, and I have several questions before I begin. May I speak frankly?" "Please do," Lillian replied, gesturing for him to sit. Dr. Richter remained standing, opening his case and withdrawing a notebook filled with dense handwriting. "You describe the Duke coughing blood, which is consistent with consumption. But you also mention fever that never fully breaks, which is less typical. And you say he has pain in his lower back and side. Yes? This is important. Can you describe exactly where this pain is located?" Lillian did her best to recall Benjamin's complaints, pointing to her own body to indicate the areas he had mentioned. Dr. Richter made quick notes, his dark eyes sharp with concentration. "And his appetite? When did it begin to fail?" "Gradually, over the past year," Lillian said. "But it worsened significantly 3 months ago." "Before or after the blood in his cough became regular?" Lillian paused, thinking back through the timeline of Benjamin's decline. "Before, I think. The blood came later." Dr. Richter made another note, then looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I will need to examine the Duke thoroughly, and I will be using methods that may seem unusual to you. I will need him to remove his shirt so I can examine his torso completely. I will press on various parts of his body, which may cause him discomfort. And I will need access to any medical records from his military service, particularly any reports of injuries or illnesses during his time in the colonies." "I can provide whatever records exist," Lillian said. "But why are his military records important? His consumption developed long after he returned from service." "Perhaps," Dr. Richter said, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "Or perhaps not. Let us see what the examination reveals before we make assumptions." Benjamin was waiting in his bedchamber, propped up against pillows, his face drawn with fatigue. Dr. Cavendish had insisted on being present for the examination, and he stood near the window with his arms crossed, radiating disapproval. Dr. Richter acknowledged him with a brief nod but did not engage in conversation. Instead, he approached Benjamin's bedside and began his examination immediately. What followed was unlike any medical examination Lillian had ever witnessed. Dr. Richter did not simply listen to Benjamin's chest with a stethoscope or feel his pulse. He pressed his hand systematically across Benjamin's entire torso, watching his face carefully for reactions. When he pressed on Benjamin's lower right side, just below his ribs, Benjamin gasped and went rigid with pain. "Here," Dr. Richter said, not as a question but as a statement. "How long has this area been tender?" "Months," Benjamin managed through gritted teeth. Dr. Cavendish said it was likely related to the consumption, inflammation of the tissues. "Perhaps," Dr. Richter murmured, but his tone suggested skepticism. He continued his examination, pressing, listening, observing. He asked Benjamin to cough deliberately and watched not just the blood that came up but the way Benjamin's body moved, where the pain seemed to originate. He examined Benjamin's eyes and tongue with intense focus. He even smelled Benjamin's breath, leaning close in a way that made Dr. Cavendish sputter with indignation. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Cavendish protested. "I must object to these theatrical methods. The diagnosis is clear, and subjecting the Duke to this uncomfortable probing serves no purpose." Dr. Richter straightened and turned to face the English physician. "You have diagnosed consumption based on the coughing of blood and the wasting of the body, yes? But tell me, Dr. Cavendish, have you examined the Duke's military medical records? Do you know if he suffered any injuries during his service that might have long-term consequences?" "I am aware of his general medical history," Dr. Cavendish replied stiffly, "and I fail to see how a war wound from 15 years ago could be relevant to a pulmonary disease." "Then you lack imagination," Dr. Richter said bluntly, and Lillian saw Dr. Cavendish's face turn purple with rage. Before the English doctor could respond, Dr. Richter turned to Lillian. "Your Grace, I need those military records immediately. And I need to speak with anyone who was with the Duke during his service, anyone who might remember injuries or illnesses he suffered." The records were located in Benjamin's study, carefully preserved in a wooden box. Dr. Richter spread them across the desk, reading through reports and medical notes with fierce concentration while Benjamin rested upstairs and Dr. Cavendish paced angrily in the hall outside. Lillian watched as the Prussian doctor's expression shifted from curiosity to focused intensity. "Here," he said finally, tapping one yellowed page. "In 1838, the Duke was treated for a severe fever following a skirmish with local insurgents. The field surgeon noted a deep puncture wound to his lower right abdomen, possibly from a blade or bayonet. The wound was cleaned and stitched, and he recovered. But look at this note here, written 2 months later. He reported persistent pain in that same area, but the surgeon attributed it to scarring and recommended rest." Lillian leaned over his shoulder, reading the faded handwriting. "What does this mean?" Dr. Richter looked up at her, and for the first time since his arrival, his expression showed something like excitement. "It means that everything Dr. Cavendish believes about your husband's condition may be wrong. The symptoms that look like consumption, the fever, the wasting, the blood, they could all be caused by something entirely different. Something that has been hiding inside your husband's body since that wound 15 years ago, slowly poisoning him from within." What are you suggesting?" Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "I am suggesting that your husband does not have consumption at all," Dr. Richter said. "I believe he has a deep internal abscess, likely formed from that old war wound. The infection has been contained but never fully healed, and now it is leaking poison into his bloodstream. The symptoms mimic consumption perfectly, which is why every English doctor has made the same wrong diagnosis." The room seemed to tilt around Lillian. "If you are right, if it is not consumption, then can it be treated?" Dr. Richter's expression grew grave. "It can be treated, yes. But the treatment is dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than the disease itself. The abscess would need to be surgically opened and drained, and the infected tissue removed. In London, with English surgical methods, such an operation would almost certainly kill him through post-operative infection. Your doctors do not understand about germs, about the invisible enemies that cause surgical wounds to go septic." He paused, watching her carefully. "But I have methods, Prussian methods, that could give him a chance. Not a certainty, but a chance. The question is whether you are willing to risk everything on that chance, knowing that the surgery itself might kill him faster than the disease." Lillian looked down at the military records spread across the desk, at the faded note about a puncture wound from 15 years ago that might hold the key to saving Benjamin's life. She thought of Dr. Cavendish's certainty, of the 4 to 6 months he had pronounced as inevitable, of the quiet acceptance with which Benjamin had prepared for death. And she thought of her mother, who had waited 7 years for a love that never returned, and of Benjamin, who had loved her across 2 decades and beyond the grave itself. "Tell me everything," she said to Dr. Richter, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Tell me what would be required, what the risks are, and what we would need to do. And then I will tell my husband that we have found hope where everyone else saw only death." Charles Bramwell arrived at Lockhart Manor 3 days after Dr. Richter's examination, And he did not come alone. Lillian was in the morning room reviewing Dr. Richter's detailed notes about the proposed surgery when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall. Raised voices, the butler's protests, and then her uncle's familiar bark of authority demanding to see the Duchess immediately. She had barely risen from her chair when the door burst open. Charles strode in with the confidence of a man who believed he had every right to be there, his face flushed with anger and self-righteousness. Behind him came Dr. Cavendish, his expression grim, and a third man Lillian did not recognize, a thin, severe-looking gentleman in black who carried a leather document case. "Uncle Charles," Lillian said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I was not expecting you. If you had sent word, I would have prepared to receive you properly." "There is no time for social niceties," Charles snapped, gesturing impatiently at the room. "I have come because Dr. Cavendish has informed me of the reckless and frankly alarming decisions you have been making. Bringing in some foreign charlatan, spending vast sums on impossible consultations, and now I hear you are actually considering allowing this Prussian butcher to perform surgery on the Duke." Lillian felt heat rising to her cheeks, but she lifted her chin and met her uncle's glare without flinching. "Dr. Richter is not a charlatan. He is a respected physician who has successfully treated cases that other doctors declared hopeless. And yes, I am considering his recommendation because it offers hope where English medicine offers only death." "Hope?" Dr. Cavendish stepped forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your Grace, what this man is proposing is not hope, it is madness. Surgical intervention in a case of advanced consumption is not only pointless but actively cruel. The Duke's lungs are diseased beyond repair. Cutting into him will only hasten his end and subject him to unnecessary agony in his final days." "Dr. Richter does not believe the Duke has consumption," Lillian said firmly. "He has found evidence of an internal abscess that has been misdiagnosed. If he is correct, surgery could save my husband's life." The thin man in black cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Grace, permit me to introduce myself. I am Mr. William Thornton, a solicitor retained by Mr. Bramwell. I have been asked to review the financial expenditures from the Lockhart estate over the past 2 months." He opened his document case and withdrew several papers. "The sums you have spent on foreign consultations, the sale of personal property, the bank draft sent to Prussia, these transactions raise serious concerns about your capacity to manage the Duke's affairs responsibly." Lillian's hands clenched at her sides. "Those were my personal possessions that I sold, and the money I spent was mine to use as I saw fit. I have not touched a single penny of the Duke's estate without proper authorization." "But you intend to," Charles interjected, moving closer with barely contained fury. "Dr. Cavendish tells me this surgery, if it goes forward, will cost thousands of pounds. Money that should be preserved for the estate, for the creditors your father left behind, for the restoration of our family's standing. Instead, you would throw it away on a procedure that will almost certainly kill the Duke faster than the disease itself." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Lillian felt something inside her snap, some final restraint that had kept her dutiful and compliant her entire life. "You are not concerned about the Duke's welfare," she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. "You are concerned about your inheritance. You arranged this marriage as a business transaction, and now you are furious that I am refusing to simply stand by and wait for my husband to die so you can claim your share of his fortune." Charles's face went purple. "How dare you speak to me with such disrespect? I am your guardian, your family, and I have only ever acted in your best interests. If you had any sense, any gratitude for what I have done for you, you would listen to reason and send this Prussian quack back to Berlin before he does irreparable harm." "The Duke is dying," Dr. Cavendish added, his tone more measured but equally condemning. "Every day he grows weaker. Dr. Richter's theory about an abscess is nothing more than speculation designed to extract money from a desperate young woman who cannot accept the inevitable. I have seen this pattern before, foreign doctors preying on families who refuse to accept a terminal diagnosis. Do not let yourself be fooled, Your Grace." Before Lillian could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "That is quite enough. Everyone turned to see Benjamin standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his face pale with exhaustion but his eyes blazing with anger. He must have heard the commotion and dragged himself from his bedchamber, though the effort had clearly cost him dearly. "Mr. Bramwell, Dr. Cavendish, Mr. Thornton, you will cease this harassment of my wife immediately." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but Benjamin raised one trembling hand to silence him. "I am still Duke of Lockhart, and I am still of sound mind, however failing my body may be. My wife has my complete support in pursuing any medical treatment she deems appropriate. If she wishes to consult with Dr. Richter, that is her right and mine. If she wishes to proceed with surgery, I will submit to it gladly. And if any of you attempt to interfere with her decisions or question her judgment again, you will find yourselves removed from this house and barred from returning." The authority in his voice, despite its weakness, left no room for argument. Charles looked as though he might explode, but Mr. Thornton placed a restraining hand on his arm. Dr. Cavendish's expression had gone rigid with professional outrage. Benjamin crossed the room slowly, each step requiring visible effort, until he stood beside Lillian. He reached for her hand, and she gave it to him gladly, feeling the tremor in his grip but also the determination. "My wife is the bravest, most devoted person I have ever known," he said quietly but clearly. "While you see only expenses and inconvenience, she sees a life worth fighting for. While you offer resignation and death, she offers hope and courage. I suggest you all remember that you are guests in my home, and unwelcome guests at that." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Charles turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, Mr. Thornton hurrying after him. Dr. Cavendish lingered for a moment, his gaze moving between Benjamin and Lillian. "I hope you do not come to regret this decision, Your Grace," he said to Benjamin. "But I can no longer in good conscience continue as your physician if you insist on pursuing this dangerous course." He gave a curt bow and followed the others out. When the door closed behind them, Benjamin swayed slightly, and Lillian quickly guided him to the nearest chair. His breathing was labored, and sweat beaded on his brow from the exertion. But when he looked up at her, there was something like pride in his eyes. "Thank you," Lillian whispered, kneeling beside his chair. "You should not have exhausted yourself coming down here, but thank you." Benjamin managed a weak smile. "You stood up to them magnificently. I merely finished what you had already begun." He squeezed her hand gently. "We are in this together now, are we not? Whatever comes next, we face it as partners." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded. "Together," she agreed. "No matter what comes." Dr. Richter returned to Lockhart Manor the following afternoon, carrying with him a detailed written report and several medical diagrams that he spread across the library table. Lillian and Benjamin sat together on the sofa, united in their apprehension and hope. The confrontation with Charles had left them both shaken but also strangely fortified, their partnership solidified by the shared defiance of those who would have them simply surrender to fate. The Prussian doctor wasted no time on pleasantries. He placed the military medical records beside his own notes and began to explain his findings with the systematic precision of a man accustomed to teaching skeptical colleagues. "The diagnosis of consumption made by Dr. Cavendish and your other physicians is understandable given the symptoms, but it is wrong. Everything you are experiencing, Your Grace, the fever, the wasting, the blood you cough up, can be explained by a completely different condition." He pointed to the faded military report from 1838, tracing the words with one finger. "This puncture wound to your lower right abdomen. You told me you barely remember it. The field surgeon treated it, you recovered quickly, and you thought nothing more of it. But wounds like this, deep penetrating injuries in areas where the body has many folds and pockets, they can create spaces where infection hides and festers. Not enough to kill you quickly, but enough to slowly poison you over years." Benjamin leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. "You believe that wound from 15 years ago is causing my current symptoms?" "I believe the wound created an abscess, a pocket of infection deep within your abdominal cavity," Dr. Richter explained. "Over the years, this abscess has grown, collecting pus and diseased tissue. The infection leaks toxins into your bloodstream, causing the fever that never fully breaks. Your body tries to fight it, but it cannot reach the source, so you waste away as your strength is constantly drained. The pressure from the abscess affects nearby organs, causes pain in your back and side, disrupts your digestion, which is why you cannot keep food down. Lillian tried to follow the explanation, her mind racing. But what about the blood he coughs up? How does an abdominal wound cause that? Dr. Richter nodded approvingly at her question. The toxins in the blood cause inflammation throughout the body, including in the lungs and throat. Small vessels rupture, producing blood. It looks exactly like consumption, which is why every physician who has examined you made that diagnosis. They saw the symptoms they expected to see and looked no further. He pulled out one of his diagrams, a detailed anatomical drawing showing the human torso with a dark spot marked in the lower right quadrant. I have seen 3 cases like this in my career, all in military men with old war wounds. Each one was diagnosed with consumption or other wasting diseases. 2 died before the true cause was discovered. The 3rd I was able to save through surgery. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Benjamin's hand found Lillian's, gripping it tightly. "You are certain of this diagnosis?" he asked quietly. "As certain as I can be without opening you up to see directly," Dr. Richter replied honestly. "But the evidence is compelling. The location of your pain corresponds exactly to where the old wound was. The pattern of your fever, the way it spikes and falls but never truly resolves, that is consistent with a contained infection rather than a disease of the lungs. And most telling, you have survived far longer than most consumption patients at this advanced stage. If your lungs were truly destroyed by disease, you would have died months ago." Lillian felt hope and terror warring in her chest. "If you are right, if it is an abscess, can you cure him?" Dr. Richter's expression grew grave. "I can attempt to cure him, but you must understand the risks. The surgery would require opening the abdomen, locating the abscess, draining all the infected material, and removing any diseased tissue. This alone is dangerous, but the greater danger comes after. In England, nearly every patient who undergoes abdominal surgery dies within days from what you call surgical fever. What I call septic infection." He pulled out another document covered in statistics and percentages that made Lillian's stomach turn. In London hospitals, the death rate from post-operative infection is approximately 80 to 90% for abdominal surgeries. The surgeons here, they operate in their street clothes, they do not wash their hands between patients, they use instruments that are cleaned with dirty water. They do not understand that disease is caused by tiny living organisms too small to see, germs that enter wounds and multiply, poisoning the blood. "But you understand this?" Benjamin asked, his voice hoarse. "In Prussia, we have been studying the work of physicians who have proven the existence of these germs. We have developed methods to kill them before they can cause infection. We boil our instruments in water until no living thing can survive. We wash our hands with strong soap and chemicals. We clean the surgical area with carbolic acid. We use only fresh, boiled linens. These practices, they seem excessive to English doctors, but they reduce the death rate from infection to perhaps 30 or 40%. Lillian did quick calculations in her head and felt her heart sink. That still means more than 1 in 3 patients die even with your methods. "Yes," Dr. Richter said bluntly. "I will not lie to you. This surgery is extraordinarily dangerous. The Duke is already weakened by months of illness. The procedure itself will put tremendous strain on his body. And even if everything goes perfectly, even if I successfully remove the abscess and he survives the immediate aftermath, infection could still claim him in the days that follow." He looked directly at Benjamin. "If we do nothing, Dr. Cavendish's prognosis is likely correct. You have perhaps 4 to 6 months, and the end will be difficult. But if we attempt this surgery, you could die on the operating table, or you could die 3 days later from infection, or you could survive and make a complete recovery. Those are your choices." The library was utterly silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Lillian felt Benjamin's hand trembling in hers, or perhaps it was her own hand trembling. She looked at him, at this man who had loved her mother across decades, who had married her to fulfill a promise, who had become so much more to her than a dying duty. The thought of losing him was unbearable, but the thought of him dying slowly over the coming months, wasting away while she watched helplessly, was equally terrible. "If you were in my position," Benjamin said finally, his voice steady despite everything, "what would you choose?" Dr. Richter considered the question carefully before answering. "If I were dying slowly with no hope of recovery under conventional treatment, and someone offered me even a small chance at life, no matter how dangerous, I would take it. I would rather die fighting than waste away in resignation. But that is my choice, Your Grace. You must make your own." Benjamin closed his eyes for a long moment, and Lillian watched emotions play across his gaunt face. Fear, hope, determination, and something that looked like relief. When he opened his eyes again, he looked first at Lillian, then at Dr. Richter. "How soon can you be ready to perform this surgery?" After Dr. Richter departed to arrange for the necessary surgical supplies, Lillian and Benjamin remained in the library, the weight of the decision pressing down on them like a physical force. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the room, and neither of them moved to add more wood. They sat in silence for a long time, hands still clasped, each lost in thoughts too profound for easy words. Finally, Benjamin spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to understand something, Lillian. If I die on that operating table, or in the days after from infection, you will carry that burden for the rest of your life. You will wonder if you made the right choice, if I might have had those final months that Dr. Cavendish promised. I do not want to leave you with that guilt." Lillian turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And if we do nothing, if I sit by your bedside for 4 months watching you waste away, knowing that there might have been a chance, however small, that we did not take, do you think I would carry any less guilt? Do you think I could live with myself knowing I chose the safe path, the path of certain loss, because I was too afraid to fight?" Benjamin's hand tightened on hers. "This is not your burden to carry. You have already done more than anyone could have expected. You found Dr. Richter. You stood up to your uncle. You gave me hope when I had resigned myself to death. But Lillian, I am at peace with dying. I have lived long enough to know that life is not measured in years but in moments of meaning. These past weeks with you, learning that Catherine's daughter has a mother's courage and fierce heart, that has been gift enough." "It is not enough for me," Lillian said, her voice breaking. "Benjamin, when you told me about my mother, about the love you carried for 20 years, I thought I understood. But I did not truly. Not until these past weeks when I have come to know you, not as a dying duty but as a man of honor and depth and quiet kindness." She wiped at her tears with her free hand, not bothering to hide them. "I have fallen in love with you. Not with the ghost of my mother's past, but with you. And I cannot bear the thought of losing you without fighting with everything I have." The confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its vulnerability. Benjamin stared at her, his grey eyes wide with astonishment, and Lillian saw tears spill down his gaunt cheeks. "You love me," he whispered, as though the words were too precious to speak aloud. "I do," Lillian said simply. "I know our marriage began as something else, as obligation and promise and duty. But it has become real to me. You have become real to me. And if there is even the smallest chance that surgery could give us more time together, more mornings and afternoons and evenings like these, then I want to take that chance. I need to take it." Benjamin released her hand only to reach up and cup her face gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I never expected this. I married you to fulfill a promise, to give you security and freedom. I never imagined that I might find something so precious in the time I had left." His voice was thick with emotion. "I love you, Lillian. Not as Catherine's daughter, but as yourself. As the remarkable woman who refused to accept defeat, who fought for a dying man everyone else had already mourned. You have given me something I thought lost forever, a reason to want to live rather than simply waiting to die. They came together then, foreheads touching, tears mingling, both of them trembling with the force of what they had confessed. For a long moment, they simply breathed together, drawing strength from each other's presence. When they finally pulled back, Benjamin's expression had shifted from resignation to something like determination. "Very well," he said quietly. "We will do this surgery. We will fight together, and whatever happens, we will face it knowing that we chose love over fear." He took both her hands in his. "But Lillian, you must promise me something. If the worst happens, if I do not survive, you will not let this destroy you. You will take the future I wanted to give you and live it fully, without regret." "I promise to try," Lillian said, the same word she had given him before, the only honest answer she could offer. "But first, we are going to do everything possible to ensure you survive. Dr. Richter said he needs assistance during the surgery, someone to hand him instruments and help maintain the sterile conditions. I intend to be that person." Benjamin's eyes widened in alarm. "Absolutely not. The surgery will be dangerous and disturbing. You should not have to witness such things." "I am your wife," Lillian said firmly. "I will not wait outside while someone else fights for your life. Dr. Richter will need help from someone who follows his instructions precisely, who understands how critical cleanliness is, who will not question his methods. I can be that person. I will be that person." She met his gaze steadily. "We face this together, Benjamin. That was your promise to me. Let me keep the same promise to you." Benjamin searched her face for a long moment, then slowly nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "You are extraordinary. Do you know that? Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her despite the pain the movement caused. "Very well. We will do this together, all of it. And may God have mercy on us both." The surgery was scheduled for dawn 3 days later, giving Dr. Richter time to prepare everything according to his exacting standards. The largest guest chamber on the ground floor was transformed into what he called an operating theatre, though it bore no resemblance to the surgical rooms in London hospitals. Every piece of furniture was removed except for a sturdy table brought up from the servants' hall. The windows were sealed with fresh paper, the floors scrubbed with carbolic acid until the sharp chemical smell made Lillian's eyes water. Dr. Richter supervised every detail personally, rejecting linens that were not perfectly white, insisting that the room be heated to uncomfortable warmth to prevent chill during the procedure. The night before the surgery, Lillian could not sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the house settle around her, thinking about what the morning would bring. She had read Dr. Richter's detailed instructions on maintaining sterile conditions, had practiced the hand-washing protocol until her skin was raw, had memorized the names and purposes of each surgical instrument. But no amount of preparation could fully steel her for what she was about to witness. Just before midnight, she rose and went to Benjamin's chamber. She found him awake as well, sitting by the window and looking out at the moonlit grounds. He turned when she entered, and without words, she crossed the room and sat beside him. They held each other through the remaining hours of darkness, drawing strength from shared warmth and the steady rhythm of each other's breathing. Dr. Richter arrived before first light, bringing with him 2 large cases of equipment and a grim intensity that left no room for doubt or hesitation. He had Lillian and the 2 servants he deemed trustworthy enough to assist begin the preparation process immediately. Water was set to boil in enormous pots in the kitchen, far more than seemed necessary. Every surgical instrument was submerged in the boiling water for a full 10 minutes, then transferred with sterilized tongs to a basin of carbolic acid solution. The smell was overwhelming, but Dr. Richter insisted it was essential. "Germs cannot survive boiling water or strong chemicals," he explained as he worked. "Every surface, every tool, every piece of cloth that touches the duke during surgery must be treated this way. One moment of carelessness, one unwashed hand or contaminated instrument, and all our efforts will be for nothing." Lillian scrubbed her hands according to his instructions, using harsh soap and a stiff brush until her skin was pink and tender. Then she plunged them into a basin of diluted carbolic acid, gritting her teeth against the sting. Dr. Richter inspected her hands critically before nodding his approval. He showed her how to put on the clean white apron he had brought, how to touch only the inside of it, how to keep her hands away from her face and hair. Benjamin was brought to the operating theatre just as dawn broke. He had been given a small dose of laudanum to calm him but remained conscious and alert. Dr. Richter believed in keeping patients awake during abdominal surgery when possible, as their responses helped guide the procedure. Lillian saw the fear in Benjamin's eyes as he was helped onto the table, but also trust and determination. "I am ready," he said quietly, reaching for Lillian's hand one last time. "Whatever happens, know that these past weeks with you have been the greatest gift of my life." Lillian squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then Dr. Richter nodded to her, and she had to step back to her assigned position at the instrument table. The surgery began with Dr. Richter administering chloroform through a cloth held over Benjamin's nose and mouth. The anesthetic took effect quickly, Benjamin's body going slack, his breathing becoming deep and regular. What followed was the most harrowing experience of Lillian's life. Dr. Richter made his first incision with calm precision, the blade cutting through skin and muscle in the lower right quadrant of Benjamin's abdomen. Blood welled up immediately, and Lillian's stomach lurched, but she forced herself to remain steady. Dr. Richter called for instruments in quick succession, and she handed them over with trembling hands, careful to touch only the sterilized handles. As the doctor worked deeper into the abdominal cavity, Lillian caught her first glimpse of what lay hidden inside. The abscess, when Dr. Richter finally exposed it, was enormous, a grotesque pocket of diseased tissue the size of a large orange, pressing against Benjamin's internal organs. The smell that escaped when Dr. Richter punctured it was so foul that one of the servants fled the room retching. But Lillian remained at her post, handing instruments, holding basins, following every instruction with mechanical precision even as her mind reeled at what she was witnessing. Dr. Richter worked with intense concentration, draining the infected material, carefully excising diseased tissue, irrigating the cavity with boiled water and carbolic solution. He explained each step in a low, steady voice, as much to keep himself focused as to educate her. "This is what has been poisoning him," he said, indicating the mass of infected tissue he had removed. 15 years this has been growing, slowly killing him. But see here, the surrounding tissue is healthy. We caught it in time. The surgery took nearly 3 hours. By the time Dr. Richter made his final suture, closing the incision with silk thread that had been boiled and soaked in carbolic acid, Lillian's legs were shaking with exhaustion and her back ached from standing rigid. But as she looked down at Benjamin's face, she saw something that made her heart leap. The grayish pallor that had marked his skin for months was already fading. His breathing, though shallow from the chloroform, was easier and more regular than she had heard in weeks. "The fever," Dr. Richter said, pressing his hand to Benjamin's forehead. "It is already cooler. The source of the infection is gone. Now we wait and see if his body can heal without secondary infection setting in." The next 48 hours were a test of endurance unlike anything Lillian had ever experienced. Benjamin was moved to a freshly prepared chamber where every surface had been scrubbed with carbolic acid. Only Lillian and Dr. Richter were permitted to enter, and both had to wash their hands thoroughly each time. The bandages were changed twice daily using only boiled linens and sterilized instruments. Every basin, every cloth, every drop of water that touched Benjamin's wound was treated first. Lillian slept in a chair beside his bed, waking every few hours to check his condition. Benjamin drifted in and out of consciousness, the laudanum keeping him comfortable but confused. Several times he called out for Catherine, and once he woke thinking he was back in the colonies during the war. Each time, Lillian took his hand and spoke softly until he recognized her and settled back into sleep. The fever was their greatest enemy now. Dr. Richter had warned that even with all their precautions, infection could still take hold in the surgical wound. For the first day and night, Benjamin's temperature remained slightly elevated, and every hour Lillian checked it with growing dread, watching for the sharp spike that would signal septic infection. But on the morning of the second day, something miraculous happened. When Lillian pressed her hand to Benjamin's forehead, she found his skin cool and dry for the first time in months. Not the fevered heat she had grown accustomed to, but normal human warmth. She checked again, certain she must be mistaken, then called for Dr. Richter. The Prussian doctor made his own examination, then straightened with an expression of cautious satisfaction. The fever has broken completely. There is no sign of infection in the wound. His pulse is stronger, his breathing clear. These are very good signs, Your Grace. Very good indeed. Lillian sank into the chair beside Benjamin's bed, tears streaming down her face as relief washed over her in waves. It was not over yet, Dr. Richter cautioned. They would need to maintain vigilance for several more days, continue the strict protocols, watch for any sign of complications. But for the first time since that terrible coughing spell weeks ago, Lillian allowed herself to believe that Benjamin might actually survive. On the 4th day after surgery, Benjamin woke fully for the first time, his eyes clear and focused. He looked around the room in confusion before his gaze found Lillian sitting beside him. "Did we do it?" he asked, his voice weak but unmistakably alive. "Did it work?" Lillian took his hand carefully, mindful of the bandages and the healing wound beneath. "You are going to live," she said, her voice breaking with joy. "The abscess is gone, the fever has broken, and you are going to live." Benjamin's eyes filled with tears, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then we did it together," he whispered. "You and I and Dr. Richter, we challenged death itself and won." Benjamin's recovery was slow at first, measured in tiny victories that felt like miracles. The first time he sat up without assistance, 3 weeks after surgery. The first time he walked from his bed to the chair by the window, leaning heavily on Lillian's arm but moving under his own power. The first meal he ate without nausea, actually tasting the food and asking for more. Each small triumph built upon the last, and with each one, the grey shadow of death that had haunted him for so long receded a little further. Dr. Richter remained at Lockhart Manor for 6 weeks, monitoring Benjamin's progress with the careful attention of a scientist documenting a revolutionary experiment. Because that was what this was, he explained to Lillian one afternoon as they reviewed Benjamin's latest measurements. A case that would be written about in medical journals, that would challenge the certainty of physicians across Europe, that would prove the existence of conditions that mimicked other diseases and the efficacy of aseptic surgical techniques. When the time came for Dr. Richter to return to Berlin, Benjamin insisted on coming downstairs to see him off, though the effort left him exhausted for the rest of the day. The two men clasped hands in the entrance hall, and there were tears in Benjamin's eyes as he spoke. "You gave me back my life. I can never repay that debt." Dr. Richter shook his head firmly. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. It was your wife's courage and determination that saved you. I merely provided the knowledge and the skill. Without her refusing to accept what every other doctor proclaimed as certain, you would have died in 4 months as predicted. She is the hero of this story, not I." Before he departed, Dr. Richter made Benjamin and Lillian promise to write to him regularly with updates on the recovery. He also extracted a more unusual promise, one that made them both laugh through their tears. "When you have your first child," he said with a rare smile, "I expect an invitation to attend the birth. I want to see with my own eyes that the Duke I operated on has become a father. That will be proof enough that our methods work." By late summer, Benjamin's transformation was so complete that it seemed almost impossible that he had been at death's door mere months before. His weight returned, filling out the gaunt hollows of his face and restoring strength to his frame. The silver in his hair remained, but it no longer made him look ancient, merely distinguished. His grey eyes, once dulled by illness, regained their intensity and warmth. He could walk the grounds of the estate without assistance, could ride his horse for short distances, could stay awake through an entire evening without exhaustion claiming him. It was Benjamin who first suggested hosting a ball. They were sitting in the conservatory on an August afternoon, Lillian reading aloud from a book of poetry while Benjamin listened with his eyes closed and a peaceful expression on his face. When she finished the poem, He opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "I want London society to see what you have done," he said quietly. "I want them to know that the pitted bride they whispered about is the woman who saved my life through sheer force of will and revolutionary thinking. I want to show them that love and courage can triumph over death itself." Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Benjamin, I am not sure I want that kind of attention. What we did, what we went through, it feels too private to share with people who only care about gossip and spectacle." But Benjamin took her hand, his grip strong and sure in a way it had not been for over a year. "They will talk about us regardless. Let us at least control the narrative. Let us show them not a victim and a dying man, but a partnership founded on love and sacrifice. Please, Lillian, let me honor you properly." So the invitations went out in early September for a grand ball to be held at Lockhart Manor in mid-October, 6 months to the day after their wedding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every family of consequence in London and the surrounding counties accepted, their curiosity about the Duke's miraculous recovery and his young bride too powerful to resist. The whispers that had followed Lillian to her wedding now swirled with different questions. How had the dying Duke recovered? What had truly happened behind the closed doors of Lockhart Manor? Was it really true that the Duchess had brought in a foreign doctor and defied every respectable physician in London? As the date of the ball approached, Lillian found herself increasingly nervous. She would be facing the same society that had pitied her, that had whispered about her sacrifice and her inevitable widowhood. She would see her Uncle Charles again, and Dr. Cavendish, and all the others who had been so certain that Benjamin would be dead by autumn. Part of her wanted to hide from their judgment, but a stronger part, the part that had fought so hard to save Benjamin's life, wanted to stand before them all with her head held high. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear skies. Lockhart Manor blazed with light from hundreds of candles, and the ballroom had been decorated with autumn flowers and greenery that transformed it into something magical. Lillian wore a gown of deep emerald silk that matched the ring Benjamin had placed on her finger at their wedding, her chestnut hair arranged in an elaborate style that showcased the diamond and pearl necklace that had been in Benjamin's family for generations. But it was Benjamin who took everyone's breath away when he appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He wore formal evening dress in black and white, his silver hair swept back from his face, and he stood without a cane, without support of any kind, looking every inch the powerful Duke he had once been. The assembled guests fell silent as he descended the stairs with Lillian on his arm, their eyes tracking every step, looking for signs of weakness or infirmity and finding none. The whispers began immediately, a susurrus of shock and speculation that filled the ballroom like wind through leaves. Benjamin led Lillian to the center of the room, and the orchestra fell silent. He had told her what he planned to do, but she still felt her heart racing as he began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded space. "My friends, my peers, members of London society, I thank you for honoring my wife and myself with your presence tonight. 6 months ago, you attended my wedding to this remarkable woman, and I know what you whispered then. You called her a sacrifice, a young girl sold to a dying man. You pitied her and mourned me as already dead. And I cannot blame you, for I believed those things myself." He paused, looking down at Lillian with such love that she felt tears prick her eyes. But my wife refused to accept what every learned doctor proclaimed as inevitable. She refused to let me die without a fight. Benjamin proceeded to tell the entire story to the assembled crowd. He spoke of Dr. Cavendish's diagnosis and the certainty of consumption. He spoke of Lillian's desperate search for alternative help, the sale of her jewelry, the letters sent across Europe. He spoke of Dr. Richter's revolutionary discovery that the diagnosis had been wrong, that a treatable condition had been mistaken for an incurable disease. And he spoke of the dangerous surgery, performed using Prussian methods that defied everything English medicine believed. "My wife stood beside me through it all," Benjamin said, his voice thick with emotion. "She assisted in the surgery itself, defying every convention of her class and gender. She maintained the strict protocols that prevented infection when every instinct must have told her they were excessive and unnecessary. She chose revolutionary science over comfortable tradition. She chose hope over resignation. She chose love over fear. And in doing so, she saved not merely my life, but gave us both something far more precious than I ever imagined possible when I married her to fulfill an old promise. She gave us a marriage founded on profound, chosen love. The ballroom erupted in applause, and Lillian saw more than one lady dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She also saw Uncle Charles standing near the back of the room, his face frozen in an expression somewhere between shock and fury. Beside him, Dr. Cavendish looked pale and uncomfortable, the vindication of his certainty transformed into humiliation by Benjamin's very presence. But most importantly, she saw the faces of London society looking at her not with pity but with something like awe. She was no longer the sacrificial lamb or the tragic bride. She was the duchess who had challenged death and won. Benjamin led her to the center of the ballroom as the orchestra began a waltz. They moved together with a grace that would have been impossible 6 months ago, Benjamin's strength and balance fully restored. As they turned across the floor, other couples joined them, but Lillian was aware only of Benjamin, of his hand warm and steady at her waist, of the way he looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. When the dance ended, Dr. Cavendish approached them, his expression humble in a way Lillian had never seen. "Your Grace, Duchess, I owe you both an apology. I was wrong in my diagnosis and wrong to dismiss Dr. Richter's theories. What you have accomplished here is nothing short of remarkable." He paused, struggling with the words. "Perhaps it is time for English medicine to learn from our colleagues on the continent. I would very much like to correspond with Dr. Richter, if you would facilitate an introduction." Benjamin accepted the apology with grace, and Lillian felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This was vindication not just for herself but for Dr. Richter's methods, for the revolutionary science that had saved Benjamin's life. Later, when the guests had moved to the supper room and the ballroom had emptied, Benjamin led Lillian out onto the terrace. The autumn night was cool and clear, stars brilliant overhead. They stood at the balustrade looking out over the grounds, and Benjamin pulled Lillian close against his side. "6 months ago, I married you thinking I had only weeks to live," he said quietly. "I thought I was giving you a future as a widow, securing your independence. I never imagined we would stand here like this, with years stretching before us instead of merely months." Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, alive and healthy and real. "6 months ago, I married a dying stranger out of duty. I never imagined I would fall so completely in love with him that I would stake everything on an impossible hope." Benjamin turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "We fought death itself and won, Lillian. We challenged medical certainty, defied social convention, and chose love when every reasonable person would have counseled resignation. What else could possibly stand in our way now?" Lillian smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We have the rest of our lives ahead of us, and we will fill them with all the love and courage that brought us to this moment." They kissed then, under the autumn stars, two people who had found each other through impossible circumstances and forged a love strong enough to conquer death. Inside, the ball continued, society celebrating their triumph. But out here on the terrace, it was just the two of them, a duchess and her duke, alive and whole and deeply, irrevocably in love. The future stretched before them like an unwritten book, and they would write it together, every page a testament to the power of love, courage, and the radical choice to never surrender hope, no matter how dire the circumstances. They had danced with death and emerged victorious, and now they would dance through life, partners in every sense, their love the legacy that would endure long after their story became legend. Lovely listeners, if this story has brought peace to your day, consider liking or subscribing. You'd be supporting a small creator in a world that needs more kindness, more love, and more gentle stories. And if you're up for it, another video will appear on your screen at the end. Click it for another beautiful love story. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the kind of love that would go above and beyond for you.